right, let's dive into one of the, I think you could say, most important concepts in political science: democracy.
Absolutely.
We are going to be tackling Chapter 4 of your comparative politics textbook.
Mm.
And I think this is a chapter, especially if you're taking Intro to Comparative Politics, that you really want to get a good, solid grasp on.
It is. Democracy, it seems like a simple concept,
Uh-huh.
but as we're going to talk about today, there's so many layers to it, from its historical roots all the way to how it plays out in the world today.
It really is. I mean, we throw this term around, democracy, but then when you really stop and think about it, you're like, well, what does that actually mean?
Right. It's one of those things like that saying that, democracy is the worst form of government except for all the others.
Yeah, it's true.
It's definitely messy,
Yeah.
it's challenging, but it's also incredibly important.
It is incredibly important. And so that's what we're going to be doing in this deep dive. We're going to be taking this Chapter 4 and really kind of getting into all the nitty-gritty. Think of us as your cheat sheet to understanding democracy in all its forms.
Yeah, we're going to be going through all the core principles, exploring all the different flavors of democracy out there, and really highlighting what makes each one tick. So yeah, are you ready to jump in?
Let's do it. So first things first.
Yeah.
Let's define democracy.
Oh.
Okay. So we always hear about this idea of power to the people, but how does that actually play out in the real world?
Yeah, that's a great question. So if we start with the word itself, democracy comes from ancient Greece, and it's made up of two parts: demos, meaning people, and kretos, meaning rule or power.
Okay.
And that's a good starting point, because those early forms of democracy, like we saw in ancient Athens, were really all about direct citizen participation.
Wow.
So can you imagine, being able to vote on every single law or policy?
Well, that's a lot of pressure.
Right. That's a lot to put on the people, but it's also, I think, pretty cool.
Yeah. I mean, I guess it brings up that idea of how we went from that model to what we see today.
Right. Because if we think about it, I mean, in large, complex societies today, could we imagine millions of people trying to vote on every single issue?
No, it'd be impossible.
It just wouldn't be practical. And that's where this idea of indirect democracy, or what we also call representative democracy, comes in.
Okay, so indirect democracy. So instead of voting on everything ourselves, we elect people to make decisions on our behalf.
Exactly. We essentially delegate that power to, these elected officials who are ideally representing our interests, and making decisions that reflect, the will of the people.
Okay. And so that's what most modern democracies practice today, right?
Exactly. But it's important to remember that even in these indirect democracies, we still see elements of direct democracy.
Yeah.
For example, think about referendums where citizens can, vote directly on a specific issue.
Right.
So it's not always this clear cut, it's direct or it's indirect. It's more like a spectrum.
Gotcha. So there are different levels of citizen participation in these systems.
Yeah.
Okay, that makes sense. But I think it's also really important to point out that just having elections, just going through the motions of electing someone, doesn't make a country a democracy, right?
You are absolutely right. There are a lot of countries out there that will say they have elections, but there are all of these other essential ingredients that have to be present for it to actually be considered a democracy.
Mm-hmm.
What do you think are some of those things?
Well, I mean, the first thing that comes to mind are free and fair elections.
Of course.
Right. So everyone should have the right to vote, assuming they're eligible.
Yeah.
There shouldn't be any intimidation. There shouldn't be any coercion. Everyone's vote should be counted equally.
That's a great one. And those elections have to be, regular. There has to be real competition between candidates and parties. But thinking bigger picture, think about what it means to actually have a voice in a democracy. What do you think that includes?
I would say, you need to be able to express your opinion, even if it's unpopular. And you shouldn't be punished for that, right?
Exactly. And that's where we get, these civil liberties like freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of the press, freedom of assembly. And these liberties are so important because they allow you to criticize the government, to organize with others, to advocate for change, to, really speak your mind. So they're really the bedrock of a functioning democracy.
Yeah. And I think along those lines, you also have these civil rights.
Absolutely.
So things that are protecting you from being discriminated against, whether it's because of your race, your religion, your gender, your sexual orientation, things like that.
Right. And so all of that kind of boils down to this idea of rule of law.
Okay.
Which essentially means that everyone in a society, including those in power, are subject to the same laws. and everyone has equal access to justice. So it's really about ensuring that there's this level playing field and that the rights of all citizens are being protected.
So it's not just, like I said, about having the election. It's about making sure that your voice matters, that your rights are protected, and that you're not subject to, like, arbitrary or discriminatory treatment from the government.
Exactly.
And I'm thinking, so this kind of all plays into what our textbook calls liberal democracies.
Yes. So when we talk about liberal democracies, we're really talking about this idea of individual freedom and making sure that the power of the government is limited and accountable to the people.
Okay. And I think that's a great kind of introduction. But I'm wondering, how does this play out in different democratic systems?
Yeah.
So I'm thinking about, the U.S. has a very different system than, say, the U.K. or France. So can we get into that a little bit?
Absolutely. So that gets to the heart of the real fascinating variety of democratic institutions that we see in different countries. And so our textbook kind of focuses on two main types of democracies. We have presidential democracies and parliamentary democracies.
Okay.
And so you're right, the U.S. is this classic example of a presidential system, while the U.K. is a prime example of a parliamentary one.
Right. So let's break those two down. So what are, like, the key differences? And why should we care?
All right, great questions. So one of the most important differences is how the executive branch is structured. So remember, that's the part of the government that's responsible for actually carrying out the laws.
Right.
And how the leader of that executive branch is chosen. So in a presidential system, like we have in the U.S., you have a president, right?
Right.
And that president is both the head of state and the head of government.
Okay.
And importantly, they're elected independently of the legislature, and they serve for this fixed term.
Okay. So even if Congress doesn't like what the president's doing, they can't just vote them out of office.
Yeah. Exactly. So there's this clear separation of powers between, the executive and the legislative branches. Now, in a parliamentary system, it's quite different. So in a parliamentary system, the head of the government is the prime minister.
Okay.
And the prime minister is actually chosen from the legislature.
Wait, so the prime minister is a member of parliament?
That's right. So essentially, the party that wins the most seats in parliament gets to choose the prime minister.
Okay.
And then that prime minister forms the government. So in that way, the executive branch is really kind of like an extension of the legislature.
Oh, that's really interesting. So the prime minister is, like, directly accountable to the parliament. Right.
Exactly.
And if they lose the support of the legislature, they can, like, get the boot.
Right. They can be removed from office through what we call a vote of no confidence.
Okay.
So it's a much more fluid and dynamic system than what you see in a presidential system.
Gotcha. Okay. So we've got these two different ways that the executive branch can be set up. But I'm wondering, what are the, pros and cons? Does one tend to, work better than the other?
Oh, man, that is the question. That's the debate that, political scientists have been having for ages.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, there's no simple answer. Each system has its own advantages and disadvantages. And what works best in one country may not work in another. It really depends on the context, the history, the political culture of a particular country.
Okay. So I guess let's get into some of these pros and cons. What are some of the strengths, I guess, we'll start there, of a presidential system?
Okay, so in a presidential system, one of the, biggest strengths is stability because the president serves for that fixed term that we talked about. You don't have that same kind of volatility that you might see in a parliamentary system where governments can change more frequently.
Right. Okay. And also, I mean, the president is directly elected by the people, right?
Yeah.
So that gives them, this strong mandate to govern, and it kind of allows them to, be a little bit more independent from the legislature.
Right. And all of that can lead to a clearer separation of powers, which, we talked about is good for kind of preventing any one branch of government from becoming too powerful.
Right.
But of course, the downside is that all that separation can sometimes lead to gridlock, especially if the president and the legislature are from different parties and they can't agree on anything.
Yeah. Which, I mean, happens all the time, right? Especially in the U.S.
All the time.
Right. Where the president wants to do something, but Congress is like, nope, not going to happen.
Yeah.
And then nothing gets done.
Exactly. And so that's one of the main criticisms of presidential systems.
Yeah.
That potential for gridlock and inefficiency, especially in, really polarized political environments.
Yeah, that makes sense. So stability on the one hand, but potential for gridlock on the other. What about parliamentary systems? So what are, I guess, some of their advantages?
Yeah. So parliamentary systems, I think, are often praised for their flexibility and responsiveness. So if a prime minister is, not getting things done or loses the support of the legislature, they can be removed pretty easily
Yeah.
through that vote of no confidence. And so this allows for much quicker responses to, changing circumstances or like political crises.
Right, yeah. So if, like, there's a huge issue and the government's not doing anything about it, they can be like, all right, you're out of here and get someone else in.
Exactly. It's like a built-in, safety valve.
Yeah.
And then also, because the executive branch comes from the legislature, there tends to be more, agreement between the two branches,
Uh-huh.
which can make it much easier to pass legislation and, get things done.
So less likely to have that gridlock that we see in the presidential systems.
Okay.
Okay, so those are some good things, but what are the downsides?
Yeah, so that same flexibility that we just talked about, that can also be a source of instability.
Oh, how so?
So governments can fall frequently, especially in systems where you have a bunch of different parties, multi-party systems.
Hmm.
And so those coalitions that they have to form to kind of get a majority, those can be very fragile. And so it can be really hard to kind of pursue these like long-term strategies or like really implement these complex reforms.
That makes sense, yeah.
And then another thing is, the prime minister isn't directly elected by the people.
Right.
So some people will say that, raises questions about their legitimacy, their accountability.
Yeah, I mean, some might argue that you're voting for the party, not the person, right?
Exactly. And so the party kind of gets to, like, choose the prime minister behind closed doors.
Yeah. Okay, so it's kind of like a trade-off, right? So you have more flexibility,
Yeah.
but it might be less stable.
Right.
You have, more responsiveness, but maybe there's less accountability.
Exactly. It's all about, like, what works for that specific country.
Yeah.
But just to make things even more complicated, some countries have these systems called semi-presidential systems,
Oh, okay.
and they kind of combine elements of both.
What, so like hybrid?
Exactly, a hybrid system.
Okay.
So we can get into that more and talk about all these other democratic institutions in the next part of our deep dive. So don't go anywhere.
We'll be right back.
So you were telling us about these semi-presidential systems, these hybrids. How do they work?
Right. So semi-presidential systems, kind of like you said, they blend features of both presidential and parliamentary democracies.
Okay.
So you have a president, like in a presidential system, and they're directly elected by the people. They have, a good amount of executive power. But you also have a prime minister, like in a parliamentary system. And the prime minister comes from the legislature, and they kind of lead the day-to-day running of the government.
Okay. So it's almost like you have two captains at the helm. I mean, is that a recipe for, like, disaster?
Mm-hmm.
Or can it actually be effective?
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. It can go either way, right?
Yeah. I mean, the key really is how that power is shared, how it's balanced between the president and the prime minister.
Uh-huh.
So in some countries, the president might have more power. In others, it's the prime minister who's really calling the shots. It just depends on, like, what their constitution says and the kind of political dynamics that are going on.
Okay, so it's all about finding that balance. So can you give me like a real world example of a country that has a semi-presidential system?
Yeah, absolutely. So France is a really good example.
Okay.
So the French president, they're elected for a fixed term, and they have a lot of power, especially when it comes to things like foreign policy, national defense.
Okay.
But the prime minister, they're more focused on domestic policy, and they work really closely with the legislature, the parliament.
Gotcha. So you've got the president looking outward and the prime minister's kind of running things on the home front.
Mm-hmm.
But what happens if they like disagree?
Mm-hmm.
What if the president wants to do one thing and the prime minister's like, no way?
Right. That's a possibility.
Yeah.
And that is one of the challenges of a semi-presidential system. Trying to figure out, well, what happens when those two executives clash?
Right.
If they come from different political parties, it can lead to what's called cohabitation.
Cohabitation.
Yeah, or basically they have to learn to cooperate. They have to compromise, even though, they come from different perspectives.
Kind of like, I don't know, roommates who don't really get along, but they have to figure out how to live together, right?
Yeah, that's a perfect analogy. And I think that's politics in a nutshell, right?
Yeah.
It's all about working together, even when you don't agree.
Yeah. I mean, it kind of makes me think about like electoral systems, right?
Mm-hmm.
So those are like the rules that determine how people actually vote and how those votes get counted and how that translates into, seats in the government.
Absolutely.
And I don't know, why do we have all these different electoral systems? Why can't it just be like whoever gets the most votes wins? Why does
Yeah.
it have to be so complicated?
Yeah, no, it can seem really complicated, right?
Yeah.
But it turns out that choosing an electoral system is not, just this like simple, straightforward thing.
Okay.
Different systems have different like strengths and weaknesses, and they can really impact, how many political parties you have, how many people turn out to vote, how stable the government is. I mean, it really affects the whole landscape.
Wow. Okay. So let's, I guess, get into some of the like common ones.
Yeah, so a really, I guess, basic one that a lot of people are familiar with is what we call plurality voting, or sometimes it's called first past the post.
Okay.
It's the one that, they use here in the US for most of our elections. And it's pretty simple, like the candidate with the most votes in a district, they win, even if they don't get a majority.
Okay. So it's kind of like a winner take all system.
Yeah.
But one of the like criticisms is that it can lead to like strategic voting,
Yes,
right?
exactly. So that's a big criticism. And it's where, voters, they feel like they have to vote for like the candidate they think has the best chance of winning, even if it's not, their favorite.
Yeah.
Because they don't want to like waste their vote.
Yeah.
So they might vote for, what they call the lesser of two evils. And so this, can really hurt smaller parties. It makes it hard for new voices to like break into the system.
Like, 'cause if you don't think someone has a chance, you're not going to vote for them. Okay. So what are some other systems then?
Right. So another big one is proportional representation.
Okay.
And this one tries to like give out seats in the legislature in proportion to, the votes that each party gets.
Okay.
So if a party gets, let's say, 30% of the votes, they should get about 30% of the seats.
Okay. So that seems a little bit more, I guess, fair, right? Because it kind of reflects the different opinions that are out there.
It can be, yeah. I mean,
Right.
especially in places that have like a lot of different political parties, this can be a good way to make sure everyone's voice is heard. It tends to lead to these multi-party systems where, you have a bunch of different parties that have a real presence in the government. And so that creates this like more dynamic, maybe a more representative political landscape. But it can also make it tougher to like form a stable government.
Right, because you need to have like a bunch of these different parties working together.
Exactly. You need coalitions. And that can be, I mean, really tough. There's a lot of negotiation, a lot of compromise that has to happen.
Yeah, yeah. So we've got these like plurality systems, which are simple, but maybe not always fair.
Right.
And then these proportional systems, which are more representative, but maybe less stable. So, I mean, is there like a happy medium?
Well, some countries, they try to find that middle ground, and they'll use what we call a mixed system.
Okay.
So it'll combine parts of both, like plurality and proportional.
Is it like a little bit of both? Okay.
Yeah, and the idea is to, try to get the best of both worlds and kind of avoid the downsides.
Right, like the Goldilocks solution.
Yeah.
Not too hot, not too cold, just right. Okay. And this is so interesting because we're seeing how, these rules, these electoral systems, they really shape the entire political landscape.
For sure. And speaking of shaping the political landscape, we can't forget about, political parties.
Right. The parties, those like groups of people who have similar ideas about how the government should be run.
Exactly.
It's funny because, the founding fathers here in the U.S., they weren't huge fans of political parties.
You really weren't.
Right.
They thought, parties would just cause division and lead to, like, instability.
Yeah.
They wanted these, like, independent-minded leaders making decisions based on, reason and what's best for the country. But, I mean, history shows us that parties are, like, almost inevitable in a democracy.
Yeah, I mean, when you think about it, parties really do help organize things. They bring people together, they get voters excited.
Yeah, they simplify things.
Yeah.
Right.
Like, they lay out their platform. You can kind of figure out, okay, do I agree with this or not?
Right. And they act as, this intermediary between you, the citizen, and this very complicated world of government.
Yeah.
They help you, kind of make sense of it all and give you a way to, like, get involved.
Right, right. But of course, parties can also be a source of, polarization and gridlock,
Oh, absolutely.
especially in places, I mean, like the U.S. with, this strong two-party system.
Right.
You kind of feel like you're always choosing between like two extremes.
Yeah. And it's important to remember that, how parties are structured, how they act, it really varies across democracies. So some places, have a ton of different parties representing all kinds of ideas, and others have just a few, like, really big dominant parties.
And that's kind of where we see like that connection back to the electoral systems, right?
Absolutely.
So proportional representation, you tend to get more of those multi-party systems.
Right.
Whereas, places like the US with that plurality system, you tend to see, two big parties dominating.
Exactly. So understanding how those two systems work together is, really important for like figuring out how democracies function.
Okay. Wow. We've talked about like semi-presidential systems and electoral systems and political parties. That's a lot.
Yeah, we've covered a lot of ground.
So, now the big question is, how do democracies, become strong? How do they become lasting? How do they avoid like falling back into, some kind of authoritarian rule?
Right. That's the heart of it all, right? It's this idea of democratic consolidation.
So we've been talking about all these different pieces of a democracy, the institutions, the systems, the actors. But I think now we have to ask that really big question. How do democracies become, stable? How do they last? How do they avoid backsliding?
Right. That's what we call democratic consolidation. It's basically the process of a new democracy. It starts out fragile, it's uncertain, and it has to kind of solidify, become stronger, and really turn into this long-lasting system.
So it's not enough to just have elections. You have to create this whole culture, this environment where people actually believe in democracy
Yeah.
and they protect it,
Mm.
even when things get tough.
Exactly. And that's what makes studying this so tricky because, there's no one definition. There's no checklist to say, yep, this country's consolidated, this one's not. It's messy. It looks different everywhere.
So how do we even begin to wrap our heads around this? How do political scientists try to figure out what makes a democracy last?
Well, there are a lot of theories out there, and some focus on the economics, some on the institutions, some on the history. It's a big puzzle.
Our textbook talks about how, like, a country's past, their previous regime, can really matter. So, if a country had some experience with democracy before, even if it was limited, they might be better at transitioning to a full democracy later on.
That's one idea. But some argue that it's more about having a strong state, regardless of what came before. A state that can enforce the law, provide services, manage conflict peacefully. Those things are crucial.
Okay, so a strong state. But what about how that transition happens? Like, does it matter if it was gradual or sudden, peaceful or violent?
Absolutely. Those are key questions. Some transitions come from within, people demanding change or the leaders themselves reforming things. Others are triggered by stuff happening outside, like foreign intervention or a neighboring regime collapsing. And how it happens, it leaves a mark.
I can imagine, like, if the transition was violent, it'd be harder for people to trust the new system.
Exactly. And this leads to another big question. Can democracy be imposed from the outside? Or does it have to come from within the society itself? It's a tough one.
And then there's this whole debate about economic development and democracy, right? The idea that as countries get richer, their citizens become more educated, they want more say, and that helps democracy take root.
Right, the modernization theory. And it makes sense, but there are lots of exceptions. Some countries get rich but don't democratize, others democratize even though they're not that wealthy. It's not a simple equation.
So it's more complex than just money. What about culture? Does that play a role?
Definitely. Political culture, like the shared values, beliefs, how people view politics, that can make or break a democracy. If a
Mhm.
culture values tolerance, compromise, peaceful solutions, that's a good sign.
So it's not just the rules, it's how people think and act.
Precisely. But measuring that, it's not easy. And it's hard to predict how culture will mix with, like, economic factors or the political institutions. It's all connected.
It sounds like there's no magic formula. Every country's different.
That's a key takeaway. And to show this, our textbook compares South Africa and Iraq, two countries with very different paths to democracy.
Okay, two very different stories. So what can we learn from them?
Well, South Africa's transition from apartheid, that was in the early 90s, it was seen as this amazing example of peaceful negotiation and reconciliation. Nelson Mandela, after being imprisoned for so long, his leadership was crucial.
Mandela's focus on forgiveness, on bringing people together, that was huge. It helped heal those deep wounds and build a foundation for a new democracy.
An incredible achievement. But even South Africa, they still face challenges. Inequality, corruption, crime. It's an ongoing struggle.
It shows that even when a democracy seems successful, you can't take it for granted. You have to keep working at it, strengthening institutions, fixing problems, protecting everyone's rights.
Exactly.
Now, with Iraq, it's a different story. Authoritarian rule, foreign intervention, sectarian violence, it's a much tougher path. The U.S. invasion in 2003, it was supposed to bring democracy, but it led to chaos.
Yes, the country fell into a brutal civil war, and those fragile democratic institutions, they couldn't really take hold amidst all that violence and instability. It shows that democracy can't be forced. It needs the right conditions, people willing to compromise, a sense of unity, and trust in the process. It's complex.
So, after all this, what's the big takeaway about democracies?
I think it's that democracy is a journey. It's always
Hmm.
evolving. You have to be vigilant, you have to adapt, and you have to believe in those core principles: free elections, rule of law, individual rights, peaceful transitions. Those are the pillars.
And we've seen how democracies can look so different. Their paths are unique, shaped by their past, their culture, their context. There's no one-size-fits-all.
But what matters is that people stay involved, they stay informed, they hold their leaders accountable, and they participate in shaping their own future. That's what makes democracy work.
Because in the end, it's about more than just rules and structures. It's about people governing themselves. And on that note, we wrap up our deep dive into the world of democracy. It's complex, it's challenging, but it's definitely worth exploring.